All right, so today we're doing a deep dive, and we're going to be talking about international trade.
Okay.
But to make things a little more fun, we're going to be talking about the trade of bourbon whiskey.
Oh, wow. That sounds like fun.
Yeah, so the big headline here is that India just slashed their import duties on American bourbon whiskey.
Oh, wow.
Like a huge reduction. We're talking from 150% down to 50%.
Really?
Yeah, and the timing of this is pretty interesting. It happened right before the Indian Prime Minister sat down with the U.S. President to talk about a potential trade deal.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, so before we get into the bourbon, I think it makes sense to talk about the bigger picture of trade between the U.S. and India.
Yeah, so the U.S. and India are aiming to more than double their trade to reach like $500 billion by 2030.
Wow, that is a big number.
Yeah, it's a huge goal.
So maybe before we get too far, can you explain exactly what customs duties are?
Yeah, so customs duties are basically like taxes,
Okay.
but they're applied to goods when they're crossing international borders.
I see.
Yeah, so governments use them to kind of regulate trade
Okay,
and protect domestic industries
makes sense.
and even generate revenue.
Okay, so a 100% reduction in these duties.
Exactly.
That means cheaper bourbon for people in India, right?
Yeah, exactly. So when you lower the taxes on something, it makes it cheaper to buy,
Yeah.
which usually means that more people will buy it.
Okay, so is India like a huge importer of bourbon then?
Not really. So in 2023-24, they imported about $2.5 million worth of bourbon.
Oh, okay, so not that much compared to the 500 billion.
Right, exactly. It's
Yeah.
still relatively small, but it is growing.
Okay.
And something else interesting is that it's not just the U.S. that's sending bourbon to India.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so you have other countries like the UAE and Singapore are also exporting bourbon to India.
Wow, and even Italy.
Yeah, even Italy.
Okay, now that's interesting. I thought bourbon was like an American thing.
Well, it is, but it's not quite as simple as just sending it directly from the U.S. to India.
Okay, so how does that work then?
So think about it like this. So you have a bottle of bourbon. It starts, let's say, in Kentucky,
Yeah.
and then it gets shipped to a place like Singapore,
Okay,
which is kind of like a logistics hub.
I see.
And then from Singapore, it gets shipped to India.
Oh, so it's not directly from the U.S. to India.
Exactly. So this is what's called re-exporting.
Okay.
And it just shows how complicated these global supply chains can be.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I never really thought about that.
Yeah, it's a whole world behind the scenes of international trade.
Yeah, so it's not just like a simple transaction between two countries.
Right. It's a whole network of interconnected movements of goods.
Okay, well, this is all super interesting, but let's get back to this trade deal between the U.S. and India.
Okay.
So what are they hoping to achieve?
Well, the main goal is to increase trade and, bring in more money for both economies.
Makes sense, but I'm sure it's not that simple.
Yeah, you're right. It's not that simple.
Okay, so what are some of the potential downsides then?
Well, for example, some industries might struggle. Well, if there's suddenly a lot more competition from imports, they might lose business.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
And that could lead to job losses in those industries.
Okay, so it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah, exactly. Some people will benefit and some people might be negatively affected.
So going back to this tariff cut on the bourbon,
Yeah,
it seems like pretty good timing.
definitely.
Like
No.
right before these trade talks, it seems like more than a coincidence.
Yeah, it seems like it could be a strategic move by India.
So what are you thinking?
Well, maybe they're trying to build some goodwill with the U.S.,
Okay.
like showing that they're willing to make concessions.
Right.
So it could be like a first step towards a bigger deal.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so even something like a tariff cut on bourbon can be a really important signal in these big international negotiations.
So it's almost like a way of communicating.
Exactly.
Wow, so there's a lot more to this than just bourbon.
Oh, definitely.
It's like a glimpse into the world of global power dynamics.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how these things play out on the world stage
Absolutely.
and how something like bourbon can become this really important piece in these complex negotiations.
It's like cultural diplomacy or something.
Yeah, in a way, it shows how trade can be about more than just economics.
Okay, so to recap, we have these two huge players, the U.S. and India.
Right.
They're trying to make a deal that could potentially affect a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
And then we have this seemingly small detail about bourbon tariffs, which could actually be a very important signal.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is all very interesting, but how does this affect the average person?
That's a great question, and it's important to think about because these trade agreements can have a real impact on people's lives.
So how could this deal affect someone listening to this right now?
Well, let's say you're a consumer.
Okay.
This deal could mean you have access to more products
Okay.
and maybe even lower prices on some things.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, it could be anything really, like the electronics you use or
Oh.
the clothes you wear
Oh, I
or
see.
even the food you eat.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So these trade agreements really influence what you can buy and how much you pay for it.
Okay, but what if I'm not just a consumer? What if I own a business?
Well, if you own a business, this deal could be good or bad for you.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, it could open up new markets for you,
Okay,
so you could sell more of your product.
I see.
But on the other hand, you might also face more competition
Okay.
because businesses from India could now sell their products here more easily.
Oh, I get it. So it's a bit of a gamble.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, and it's not just about consumers and businesses, right?
It also affects jobs.
Okay,
So some industries might see more jobs created,
okay,
but others might see jobs lost.
right.
So it's really complicated.
Yeah, this is making me realize how much our lives are affected by these things.
Yeah, it's easy to forget about it, but these global forces really shape our world.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah, we are.
We talked about Bourbon tariffs,
Right?
global supply chains, and this huge potential trade deal between the US and India.
And how it could affect everyone.
Yeah, so as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this thought.
Okay.
How do you think this trade deal might affect your life?
Yeah. What do you think?
It's a complex issue, but it's worth thinking about because it could have a real impact on all of us.
That's right. It's a global world, and we're all connected.
So cheers to that.
Cheers. It is, but the journey from the distillery to the consumer can be pretty wild.
Mm,
Like, think about it. A bottle of bourbon might start in Kentucky,
okay.
but then it gets shipped to a place like Singapore.
Okay.
And Singapore is kind of like a hub for shipping things all over the world.
Oh, okay.
So from there, it could get shipped to India.
So it's not a direct shipment from the US to India.
Exactly. And this is what's called re-exporting.
Okay.
And it just shows how complicated and interconnected global supply chains can be.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I never thought about how much goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's a whole other world.
Okay, well, let's get back to this trade deal between the US and India.
Okay.
What exactly are they hoping to achieve with this?
Well, the main goal is to more than double trade between the two countries,
Okay.
which could be huge for both economies.
So what would that look like in practice?
Well, it could mean more jobs,
Okay.
and it could mean lower prices for consumers.
Yeah, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah, it definitely has the potential to be a win-win.
But I imagine there are some potential downsides too, right?
Oh, of course, no trade deal is perfect.
But so what are some of the things that could go wrong?
Well, for one thing, some industries might be negatively impacted.
How so?
Well, if there's suddenly a lot more competition from imports,
Right.
some companies might go out of business,
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
and that could lead to job losses.
So it's like a balancing act.
Yeah, exactly. You have to weigh the potential benefits against the potential risks.
And speaking of risks, what about the timing of this Bourbon tariff cut?
Oh, yeah. The timing is very interesting.
Oh. It seems like it could be a strategic move by India.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility.
So what do you think they're trying to achieve?
Well, maybe they're trying to show the U.S. that they're serious about making a deal.
Okay,
Like they're willing to make concessions.
I see.
So it could be seen as a gesture of goodwill.
So even something like a tariff cut on bourbon can be a pretty big deal.
Exactly. In the world of international trade, every little move can have big implications.
Wow, this is really fascinating.
Yeah, it really shows how interconnected everything is.
Like this one product, bourbon, can tell us so much about the relationship between these two countries.
Exactly. It's like a window into the world of global diplomacy.
Okay, so to recap, we've got these two major players, the US and India.
Right.
They're trying to hammer out this trade deal that could have a huge impact on the global economy.
Right.
And then we have this seemingly small detail about bourbon tariffs that could actually be a really significant move.
Exactly. It just goes to show that you have to pay attention to the details.
Okay, so this is all very interesting, but how does this affect the average person?
That's a great question, and it's one that we should all be asking ourselves. Yeah, it's a good question because these trade deals, they really do. They affect people, in the real world.
Yeah, so how could this particular deal affect our listeners?
Well, think about it this way. If this trade deal goes through, it could mean that you as a consumer have access to a lot more different kinds of products.
Okay.
And it could also mean that some of the things you buy could actually become cheaper.
Oh, okay, that's interesting. So, like, what kinds of things are we talking about here?
What could really be anything, like electronics or clothes,
Okay.
even the food you buy at the grocery store.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, these trade agreements, they have a big impact on what you can buy and how much you pay for it.
Okay, but what if I'm not just a consumer? What if I'm a business owner?
Yeah, so if you're a business owner, this trade deal could be a good thing or a bad thing.
Okay, so how would it be a good thing?
Well, it could open up new markets for you.
Oh, okay. So I could sell my product to more people.
Exactly. You could suddenly have a whole new customer base in India.
Wow.
But on the other hand, you might also have to deal with more competition.
Oh, right, because businesses from India could sell their products here more easily.
Exactly. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it's a gamble.
Yeah, I think I'd say that.
Okay, so we've talked about consumers and businesses, but it also affects jobs, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So some industries might actually see an increase in jobs
Okay.
because of all the new business from exporting more goods.
Makes sense.
But other industries might see job losses.
Right, because they're facing more competition from imports.
Exactly.
Man, this is really complicated.
It is. It's really a complex web of cause and effect.
Yeah, it makes you realize how much these global forces affect our everyday lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're all connected in ways that we might not even realize.
All right, so before we wrap things up, let's just do a quick recap of what we've learned today.
Okay, so we started by talking about India's decision to cut tariffs on American bourbon whiskey.
Right, which is pretty surprising.
Yeah, 100% reduction is a pretty big deal.
And it seemed like it could be a strategic move, right before these trade talks.
Yeah, maybe a way for India to build some goodwill with the U.S.
Right, and we talked about how those tariffs affect the price of bourbon for consumers.
Yeah, and how it could benefit both American distilleries and Indian bourbon drinkers.
And then we got into the whole world of global supply chains and re-exporting.
Yeah, it's amazing how many different countries are involved in getting a bottle of bourbon from the distillery to the consumer.
Yeah, who knew it was so complicated?
Right. And then, of course, we talked about the big picture, the goal of doubling trade between the U.S. and India.
Which could have a huge impact on the global economy.
Yeah. And we talked about how it could lead to more jobs and lower prices, but also how it could create some challenges for certain industries.
Right, and finally we talked about how all of this could affect our listeners personally.
Yeah, whether you're a consumer, a business owner, or just a citizen of the world, these trade deals can have a real impact on your life.
So, as we raise a metaphorical glass to our listeners,
Yes.
we want to leave you with this thought. What other toasts or concessions might we see as these trade talks continue? And what does this whole thing tell us about the relationship between these two economic powerhouses? The U.S. and India, it's a complex and ever-changing landscape, but we hope that by taking this deep dive with us, you've gained a better understanding of the forces at play. So until next time, cheers.
Cheers.